Okay, after months of preparing my commission sheet, I think I'm finally ready to receive some money. But first, I'll go ahead and listen to Dragon Quest XI music to be prepared. What's this? Why the music in Dragon Quest XI is so terrible? Why not? I could learn something new. I'm a video game arranger myself after all.
Many minutes later.
Oh. Welp. I know what I want to do after I open up music commissions. But first, let's do some shopping. Hey Kiyomi, can you get the car ready? I'm ready to start my SCC career. Yep, I'm ready to show the world what I'm capable of. I hope I can make a good impression on my first commentary.
Many minutes later.
Okay, let me go through the checklist real quick. Let's see. A really cool background. Check. My original avatar. Check. My thumbnail. Check. A disclaimer. Check. Video media for the skip cards. Check. Okay, I think that's everything I need right now. Perfect. Let me just switch my avatar real quick. No peeking. Hello everyone, my name is Nina, and welcome to my first ever commentary. Before we begin, let me just go and provide some context as to what we're tackling today. On July 29, 2017, a Japanese video game company called Square Enix released the 11th entry in the long-running Dragon Quest video game series called Dragon Quest XI: Echoes of an Elusive Age. It was released in Japan for the Nintendo 3DS and PlayStation 4, and then it released worldwide for the PlayStation 4 and Windows on September 2018. On October 15, 2018, a YouTube channel by the name of Stop Skeletons from Fighting, a YouTube channel that produces video game documentaries and reviews, released a 22-minute video rant titled, Why the Music in Dragon Quest XI is So Terrible, where they explore why Koichi Sugiyama, the composer for Dragon Quest, would allow a bad version of his music into Dragon Quest XI. As someone who's a video game arranger myself, while I personally think the video is okay overall, I do have my own gripes with the video. Now before we dive in, I do want to make note of my part in this discussion. I am well aware the video I'm covering was made before Koichi Sugiyama passed away on September 30, 2021, and I'm also aware that the video is 4 years old, therefore it is not reflective of SSFF's current quality. With that said, there are no signs of them disowning the video, so I think it's still fair to present my points. But even if the video did get disowned, my commentary can still serve as a lesson to what not to do when making a documentary, especially when it comes to video games. Now, I'm going to be skipping a good chunk of this timestamp here since it's only the introductions. With that said, let's begin covering the video.
The intro features a lush, beautiful, full orchestra, but the rest sounds way off. Forgetting for a moment that the actual new compositions in Dragon Quest are arguably subpar, the majority of the music in Dragon Quest is made up of electronically recorded MIDI samples, which could be okay, but these MIDI samples in particular are of shocking poor quality. Are you kidding me right now? These horns? Is this GoldenEye 64? Or is this a legacy JRPG printed on a Blu-ray disc in 2018? Dragon Quest has a pedigree that almost doesn't need to be mentioned. What's important to remember is that it's so popular in Japan that mainline releases are basically national holidays. The poor quality of these MIDI sample tracks are incredibly disappointing, and aren't up to the standards set by other recent JRPGs, let alone the series that created the JRPG.
I understand not wanting to pay for a whole orchestra for your music, but can't you at least get better samples?
You may want to keep this little poor quality samples line in mind because I'll get to that later in the same interjection. With that said, I want to touch upon this line of, I can understand not wanting to pay for a full orchestra. If you're a Japanese company, Square Enix, and you know that Dragon Quest is going to make that sweet yen on name alone in Japan, then, why wouldn't you pony up the cash and get the music right? They already work with different symphonies around the world for shows, so finding one is not that hard. But if I can address the rest of your argument, the music in the PlayStation 4 version of Dragon Quest XI, just like the 3DS version, is pre-recorded streamed music files. Technically, you should call this synthesized music, not MIDI. MIDI carries no audio information. It is not itself music. Instead, it's a set of instructions that tell something that can create audio music what to do. But Dragon Quest XI doesn't use MIDI like sequenced music. Actually, on that note, let me tell you the definition of the word sound font, because this is important for my point. See, a sound font is a file format that contains samples of musical instruments as well as support for numerous music parameters. If you were to take a sound font file and apply it to a MIDI file, The instruments stored in the sound font file would override the instruments in the MIDI, allowing you to listen to the MIDI with the instruments stored in the sound font file. The MIDI format uses built-in sound card hardware to play arrangements and doesn't actually include any audio. Think of MIDI more as instructions for what the sound card will play. The real problem with the Dragon Quest XI samples is not that it's poor quality per se, but rather it doesn't have enough samples. You need different kinds of strings and horns for upbeat or calm tracks. Hell, some SNES games like Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger had a better one. The most distracting thing was how the trumpets were always bleeding at a super high volume, no matter the mood of the track. Fun fact: Final Fantasy X and Kingdom Hearts 1-2 were synthesized music and used primarily sound fonts, but nobody had an issue with that because the instruments' samples were extremely varied and textured. But more on that later.
Quack, quack.
The NES and other early video game consoles used a technology called MIDI, which we talk about in more detail in our video on plot composer Tim Follin, but in short, MIDI saved space on games by coding the notes that a system would play at a specific time, rather than including a fully pre-recorded song. This transitioned out with the rise of CD-based media, which had much more space than them cartridges. Today, in a video game context, when people say MIDI, they mean samples, or computer-generated sounds, rather than a pre-recorded song performed by a band. How can you tell if something's MIDI or not? It's the horns. It's always the horns.
Oh boy, there's a lot to unpack here. For one thing, the NES didn't use MIDI, it used tracker programs and a dedicated APU, which generates sound for games. If you were to try and make genuine 8-bit music, for example, the last thing you would do is use MIDI. Old PC games started using MIDI format, which is why sound cards were a big deal back in the day. In addition, your term of what MIDI is very faulty. MIDI is just digital music notes. It's used to trigger samples. That's it. There is no MIDI sound because it doesn't have a sound in itself, only instructions to play it. Saying you dislike MIDI because its sound quality is bad when MIDI doesn't have a sound in itself doesn't make any sense. That's like saying that you hate drinking water because of its flavor but the water doesn't actually have any flavor. The complaint wouldn't make any sense. Finally, thanks for not linking Tim Follin's video you mentioned in the description. Actually, looking at the Tim Follin's video you mentioned, nowhere in that video did you ever talk about MIDI in more detail. So unless there's something I missed, you just lied to your audience. Congratulations! While I am here, can I mention that you don't cite the sources properly? Your descriptions under your video don't have any links to the external sources you mentioned. Look, I'm not gonna say that everything you say requires a citation, but if you're making a documentary on anything that would require some sort of outside knowledge, giving your audience a resource to view for themselves would not only be helpful for the sake of education, but it would also do a better job at making your audience seeing where you're coming from, and failing to do that only gives some people a reason to doubt you.
I want to make sure that...
Why do we bring this up? Well, I mentioned that Sugiyama was born in 1931, right? Didn't even start composing Dragon Quest until his mid-50s. Well, the first mainline Dragon Quest game that came out on a CD-based system that could have theoretically contained a pre-recorded orchestral soundtrack was Dragon Quest VII for the PS1 in 2000. That's 14 years of being used to MIDI/electronic generated sounds. More specifically,
That's 14 years of being used to multiple releases of soundtracks, concerts. Are you starting to see what I'm saying?
It's almost like pre-recorded streamed music wasn't possible to handle at the time, but it's now possible in video game consoles now. Strange, isn't it?
Up to this point, the Dragon Quest games were largely handled by Enix, but this changed after Square and Enix merged in the mid-2000s. This changed things. For one thing, there was a lot more cash. This merger precipitated a few changes for fans of Dragon Quest music. For one thing, we, well, Japan, got our first release of orchestrated music in a Dragon Quest game for 2004's remake of Dragon Quest V on the PS2. It's maybe a little unfair to compare the original to this release, but I'm gonna do it anyway. Here's the SNES.
Which, this is not amazing for the SNES, but it's not bad. But then, here's that PS2. No comparison, right?
Wait, so you acknowledge that the comparison was unfair, and yet you compared both different versions anyway? You know what? I'm actually gonna elaborate on why the comparison is unfair. The reason why the comparison is unfair is that the PS2 and other later consoles had CD quality audio, which allowed for music and voice that had the potential to be truly indistinguishable from any other source or genre of music. Meanwhile, the SNES had limited solid-state memory, which, for those who don't know, is a digital electronic semiconductor device used for digital data storage, such as computer memory. If you find out that the comparison you're gonna make is faulty but still decide to go through with it anyway, then you're solely missing the point of a comparison. It's like you acknowledge that comparing apples to oranges would be unfair for multiple reasons but still decide to compare it anyway. That would be dumb. You ever thought of that?
I'm going to kill the next person I fucking see, I swear to God.
Hello, hi, I'm so happy to see you.
Now, the arguably most successful Dragon Quest game overseas is Dragon Quest VIII, which also came out in 2004, but it only received a symphonic soundtrack for its international localization. Its worldwide success is largely due to the care Square Enix put into the localization and promotion, but that Final Fantasy XII demo disc definitely didn't hurt. The Japanese version, which came out before the orchestrated soundtrack was released, had MIDI music. It's not bad. It's a pretty good version to release this game with, but here's the version the US got. Alright, to me, it just doesn't compare. You might think that this would start a trend for orchestral soundtracks in Dragon Quest games, but spoilers, it didn't. Part of the reason for that is that even though Dragon Quest VIII was very successful, the success likely didn't live up to Square Enix's expectations, with only about 1 million units sold outside of Japan. That might be why they passed off 2009's Dragon Quest IX to Nintendo to publish outside of Japan, which sold about the same despite a more aggressive ad campaign.
Okay, so Dragon Quest VIII in Japan had MIDI, synthesized music, whereas the international version did not, and it did not start a trend for orchestral soundtracks in DQ games. Cool. Now what does that have to do with Dragon Quest XI music specifically? Since it doesn't go into detail about why the music of that game is terrible, it just explains that although DQ8 was a success, the success didn't live up to Square Enix's expectations, hence why it did not start a trend for orchestral soundtracks. Listen, if you're gonna make a comparison, at least talk about why the orchestral version is better than the synthesized version.
My job here is done. But you didn't do anything.
No version of Dragon Quest IX was released with an orchestral soundtrack.
Yeah, I don't know why you said that so derisively. Look at the platform the game is on and say that one more time. Trying to fit an orchestra into a DS title is like trying to put a 3D environment into an NES cartridge. There simply isn't enough space, as I just showed. Even titles that do use pre-recorded music in STRM format often use them in combination with SSEQ, because the files are gargantuan for the cartridge and the speakers often mean they don't play at full quality, so they are usually reserved for title screen music.
We didn't get rumblings again of orchestras versus MIDIs in the Dragon Quest series for several years after, not until Dragon Quest VII and VIII got remade for Nintendo 3DS in 2013 and 2015 respectively in Japan. However, in a bit of a switcheroo, the Japanese versions of these games got some orchestrated tracks while the US releases did not. Honestly, the quality of the samples on Dragon Quest VII are not that bad. Here's the Japanese 3DS Dragon Quest VII. And here's that international version. It's, obviously the orchestra is better, but, this is acceptable.
Okay, you're now just making comparisons between synthesized and orchestra of different Dragon Quest games that have nothing to do with Dragon Quest XI music specifically. Notice how making comparisons of different versions of the same track doesn't actually give a reason why the music of Dragon Quest XI is terrible or even go to detail of what's wrong with synthesized version to begin with, aside from one aspect. If this is the amount of critical death from SSFF documental video, then that's not giving me good signs for things to come.
However, since Dragon Quest VIII already came out with a gorgeous symphonic soundtrack, Square Enix really needed to come correct to the 3DS. And yet, they didn't. Here's a comparison of the Japanese version compared to the international version. Okay, well, so what? Some of you might not even hear a difference. Or maybe it just doesn't even sound all that bad to you. Which, okay, I just don't understand, man.
I hate to be that person, but I'm not sure what you understand. The synthesized version has more present percussion and more audible bass, and the instruments are mixed to be in the front of the track as opposed to the orchestral version, which is more special and has a heavy emphasis on reverb. Now sure, you can argue that it's subjective, but in comparison to SSFF's 0 reasons as to why the synthesized version is bad, I say it's a better example. Some people, like me, grew up with 8-bit and 16-bit systems and have a fondness for more classic video game aesthetics, and some prefer a live symphony. It's not that deep.
Sugiyama holds strong opinions on copyright and basically does not want to cede ownership of his songs in any way, like by allowing them to be sampled or rearranged without his permission. He also has some other strong opinions that we'll get to in a sec.
Spoilers, this strong opinion isn't relevant and is nonsensical to the topic of the video, but I'll save that part for later.
Ghetto, 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 quack, quack.
The fact of the matter is that there's no legitimate reason to not have orchestrated tracks in Dragon Quest XI. The idea that I'm gonna sink 100 hours into this game but be subjected to this battle theme a million times? What is the deal with the sample quality of these horns? These horns! Sugiyama actually defends using MIDI on his website. Basically, Sugiyama claims he uses electronic tones because it's what people expect. It's tradition. He also prefers it because it allows him to create compositions too complicated for an orchestra. That's an interesting claim since you actually don't seem to have a problem making arrangements for an orchestra, or a string quartet, or a single freaking piano. His next claim is that he needs to protect his business and control his copyright. I think this line of thinking is that he gets to pick where each version of the song should go, and he's decided that putting MIDI soundtracks in the game will sell other soundtracks.
So ignoring how all of those claims you're making have no evidence to support what you're saying, since I already made a tangent on that earlier, can I instead point out something you're overlooking? You can be good at making arrangements for different versions, including orchestra, and still find the process of making compositions for orchestra to be complicated. For example, I can be good at playing other types of sports like baseball, soccer, football, etc., but I still find basketball too complicated to play even if I were to be good at it. It's possible to be good at something and still find it challenging. Sugiyama could very much find making composition for music easy that includes orchestra but still find the action of making composition for an orchestra too hard to do.
This is just ridiculous. The idea that people wouldn't buy soundtrack collections or go to concerts if they had access to the orchestral versions in the video game just makes no sense. The music means a lot to people, and those people would want to listen to the music when they want, not by playing through hours just to hear a certain track once. If more people had exposure to these songs, then more people would want to buy them. If anything, these games are advertisements for his performances and his CDs. Sure, it's expensive to record an orchestra, but if you're gonna do it anyway, what's the point of not delivering it to the consumer? Does he get off on this level of control?
For the most part, this is a solid section, but there's an issue here. Now I could be in the minority when I say this, but am I the only person who just doesn't see the Dragon Quest games being advertisements for Sugiyama performances? Because as far as I'm aware, Square Enix has also been known to advertise their games for different reasons aside from amazing soundtracks and soundtracks alone. It can include graphics, gameplay, storyline, and so much more.
I mean, Sugiyama does have a history of wanting to exert control on the population. He's a part of a group in Japan that actively wants to rewrite the historical record on Japanese war crimes during World War II. And he believes so strongly in their cause that he paid for this advertisement in the Washington Post denying the scope of the Nanking Massacre and that Japan sexually enslaved thousands of women during World War II, even though the Japanese government has already acknowledged that this happened. He also doesn't believe that LGBT couples should have the same access to tax programs as hetero couples, and literally laughed on his own TV show at the idea that youth LGBT suicides are a problem that need to be addressed in schools. This one actually got kind of bad for him. The blowback for this was so bad that Square Enix, which is not affiliated with that TV show, felt the need to apologize and I'm sure had a hand in his own half-hearted apology. So not only is this guy unreasonable, he's also terrible. But he has been the head of all things Dragon Quest music for over 30 years. How could he ever be replaced?
Okay, before anyone here says anything, I want to make something very clear. I am not defending Sugiyama in the slightest. In fact, I'm not happy that he's mocking LGBT people and wants to erase the history of Japanese war crimes. And I'm even left disgusted by his actions, even to this day. With that being said, I don't think that his music should be deemed good or not based on what he does separately from music. Yes, erasing history is wrong, but that has absolutely nothing to do with the sound of the music in a video game, thus making this section irrelevant and nonsensical, and you should have addressed it in a better fashion than just using it as a reason for why the Dragon Quest XI music is terrible. It makes this section come off as, well, he sucks as a person, so his music also sucks. Which? No, that's not how any of this shit works. Let me put it in another way. Imagine if I made a video praising Hannah's arts and talked about how Hannah's arts are cute, right? Then I'd briefly mention that Hannah supports trans people and I use that as a reason to why Hannah's art is cute. Although Cherry supporting trans people is great, that part would be irrelevant and non-essential for a video that I'm talking about. Don't you think? And unfortunately for you, that's exactly what this section is. Irrelevant and non-essential.
Well, he's not exactly Mozart or anything. The new compositions in Dragon Quest XI don't just have bad sound quality. They're also not that well written, especially compared to his earlier work. And you need something well written to sustain hours of gameplay.
I'm sorry, but I have got to point out this wording. So you believe there should be something composed in a competent and often entertaining style to sustain hours of gameplay? You're so vague that it actually applies to one of two things, and we'll tackle those possibilities. Either you're talking about a well-written music or you're talking about a well-written story. If it's the former, then no, you don't need well-written music to sustain hours of gameplay, or at least, not inherently. People can sink over hours into the game and it can have no qualms with its music or find it to detract from the game. The characters and the story are what can sustain people, not necessarily the music itself. However, if you're talking about the latter, then you should have made that a lot more clear to better indicate that you're talking about the story, since your wording was so poor that it sounds like a different argument than what you were intending here. Since just saying, you need something well written to sustain hours of gameplay, would get anyone confused about what you're talking about.
He actually does have an heir apparent. Hayato Matsuo, who composed music for Ogre Battle, Final Fantasy XII, and did orchestral arrangement for the Panzer Dragoon and Shenmue series, has worked with him for years and is considered to be the one who would take over for him after Sugiyama's death. Matsuo, by the way, is pro-orchestra over MIDI, even saying that live orchestra sounds much better and portrays emotion in a way that samplers just can't.
I'm sorry, what? Claiming that samplers can't convey musicality and emotion as well as live musicians is, to put it bluntly, bullshit. Hell, to give two examples of video game samplers conveying emotion well, Final Fantasy X and Kingdom Hearts are right fucking there. Both games had synthesized music and used primarily sound fonts, yet they still managed to make me and other people feel emotional. Have you listened to Night of Fate from Kingdom Hearts? Or Seymour Battle from Final Fantasy X? I can't tell you a single time when samplers wouldn't convey musicality and emotion as well as live musicians. What the hell? Okay, I think I calmed down a little. Anyway, after this, SSFF just ends their rant video with their concluding statements about Sugiyama, and with that, I think I covered pretty much everything I took issue with. I would have final thoughts, but I believe my points in this video summarize how I feel about this specific video. So yeah, just do better, I guess. Okay. So that's over, so huh. Thanks, Kiyomi. Well, I do want to make more commentaries once in a while, but it'll be a while before that happens. And besides, 1, I don't have any more material for me to cover, and 2, my main hobby right now is making music and I'll need to make some money soon. Wait, really? Sure thing, I'm sure gonna miss this home. But as the saying goes, when something ends, something new begins.
Konnichiwa!
Wait, what the fuck?